Hello, and thanks for joining us. I'm Josh Gingold, and this is a special presentation of Ziff Davis, Extending HIPAA Compliance from Electronic Health Records to Document and Data Transmissions, brought to you by eFax Corporate, the world's #1 online fax brand. Now, of course, electronic health records, or EHRs, the vendors are well aware of Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA, as well as a multitude of associated policies, acts, and exceptions. In fact, these same EHR vendors, and sometimes EMR vendors, difference between electronic health records and electronic medical records, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but these vendors often act as trusted advisors to the IT executives at hospitals and healthcare service organizations that make up their customer base. However, complying with HIPAA means more than just securing patient records in an electronic medical record or an EHR, electronic health record. By its nature, protected health information, or PHI, is used on a daily basis and shared with constituents both within and outside the health organization. This is where data breaches and HIPAA violations are more likely, when ancillary systems like records archive, email, fax servers, and document management are linked to electronic medical records, EMRs, and also these EHRs, or electronic health records. Now, this is important because while healthcare providers may take every measure possible to ensure the compliance of their core systems, their extended network may still be susceptible to failure. On this presentation, independent information security consultant Kevin Beaver from Principal Logic and Flying Penguin president and founder Davi Ottenheimer discuss how medical information specialists can extend security and encryption best practices beyond the boundaries of the core EMR system. Welcome to you both, and thanks for joining us. Now, before we begin, I just want to say that the information provided in this presentation does not constitute and is no substitute for legal or other professional advice. We strongly encourage you to consult your legal or other professional advisors for individualized guidance regarding the application of the law to your particular situations and in connection with any compliance-related concerns. With that said, Kevin and Davi, how are you both doing today?
Doing great,
well.
thank you.
Nice to have you both on, and I'm sure that everybody will be glad to take a look at both of your bios. You certainly are experts in this field. In fact, Kevin, I know that you yourself have written extensively on this topic of maintaining compliance. I want to provide a little bit of background for our audience because this is the third in a three-part series on HIPAA compliance, which has obviously become very important in the past several months of the last months of 2013 because of the omnibus final rule, which makes business associates of covered entities directly liable for compliance with the HIPAA privacy and security rules and requires a legally binding business associate agreement. Now, that's important because more and more ecosystems in organizations of all types and sizes, but particularly in healthcare, rely more heavily than ever on the vendors that make all of their digital record keeping and patient record storage, etc., that make it possible. So we talked in our first part of this series about the need for business associate agreements, which are legally binding and do protect the covered entity or the hospital, the healthcare provider, against don't necessarily protect them against the possibility of breaches, etc., but do provide some remedies for when those sorts of violations occur and makes them responsible along with the hospital. Also, these BAAs, these business associate agreements, are not required for certain private couriers and their electronic equivalents, and you can read the rest there, but what we're really talking about in a lot of cases are cloud providers, services where data, whether it's protected health information or EMR, electronic medical record information, whatever the case may be, where they're just simply a conduit. So there's an exception there, and this becomes very important to what we'll be talking about a little bit later in the presentation. But what we're really going to be talking about today is the fact that within the omnibus final rule, it's very clear that the protection of electronic health and medical records is an essential requirement of all HIPAA rules, and therefore a shared responsibility of both the covered entities, those primary care providers, hospitals, etc., and their defined business associates, which hopefully will be covered by these business associate agreements. So guys, thanks for bearing with me. As we move on here, though, I'd like to start with the fact that we have these changing IT perimeters. And as security professionals, both of you know, and I'm sure most of our audience understands, that IT has changed so much because it's no longer a matter of simply securing your data center where you have your servers and storage and all your data is basically protected not only by a lock and key, but also by the different measures that you can take electronically to ensure the security of that information. And then networking has changed as well because that's more difficult. It's not just wired anymore, but now we have these massive wireless nets that sometimes cover campuses, which is certainly the case with hospitals and larger medical groups. And the other thing that we're going to be talking about is the idea of endpoints and the fact that so many people have access to networks through a number of different types of endpoints, but are also inputting data, which also is at risk. Kevin, I'll start with you by just asking, how significant is the fact that these IT perimeters have changed so much, really, over the past 5 years significantly, and some would argue going back to the days of the first iPhone, when in 2007, when the smartphone really became, and the tablet now really became devices of first choice for many users.
Right. We've seen a ton of changes in the past 5 years and 10 years and even beyond. You know, if you look back to the origin of computing as we know it, really, things used to change by the decade, then by the year, and until recently it seemed to change every month. Now it seems like it's changing daily. And the real challenge is from a compliance perspective, and even more so from an information security and risk management perspective, how do you get your arms around all of this stuff? It used to be that we had four walls protecting all of our information assets. We had the network perimeter, the firewall or firewalls. We had all of the stuff, relatively speaking, within our control. And man, just in the past 5 years, even the past couple of years, with the explosion of the cloud, the mobile devices, everybody doing their own thing, so to speak, and especially in the healthcare environments that I see, this has become front and center. How do you actually control this stuff? And you can't secure the things that you don't control, and if you don't know where it is, and you don't even know that it exists, and if you don't fully understand what risks are applicable to your environment, then how can you possibly secure it? So it's a real challenge.
Now, Davi, this is particularly true for healthcare because we see not only the growth of hospitals into campuses where they have an ecosystem of the hospital itself and then all of these healthcare groups that surround it that may be part of the hospital or may be separate but associated with the hospital. So the perimeters for anybody working in IT in healthcare, this is especially true because it changes the nature of what it is they're trying to secure.
Well, that's very true. One of the concepts we're trying to advocate now is that data has a certain gravity to it. So it's like heavy. People talk about big data, but heavy data is another way of looking at it. So you really want the ability to share information to be successful, and you want portability as one of the key terms within HIPAA. So you want this data to be shared.
I think we lost Davi there. Davi, if you can hear me, if you can dial back in. Kevin, when we talk about the gravity of data, and I'm sure that this is something that you deal with all the time as well, but it really is true. It's making its way to where it needs to be, and that changes for a healthcare group of any type because they need to know where that data is falling. Davi, are you back with us?
This is Kevin. I'm back.
Hey, Kevin. I think that we lost the connection there for a minute, and I apologize for the technical difficulties. As we wait for Davi, I don't know if you heard my question, Kevin, but Davi mentioned this idea of the gravity of data and the fact that,
Right.
For all intents and purposes, data is flowing to where it needs to be, whether it's an application or to be stored in an archive. And this is a particular challenge for healthcare because, of course, this data sometimes includes a lot of protected information and very personal information about patients.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the essence of computers and networks and why we have this technology in the first place. It needs to be accessible. It needs to be fluid. It needs to be mobile. And I guess in terms of what academia says, it wants to be free. And therein lies the problem. We have to somehow figure out how to control this data as it's moving about. And it gets back to the sort of the premise of what I believe about one of the greatest challenges in information security is that you cannot secure what you don't acknowledge. And a lot of these healthcare providers have no idea where the information is that they're actually being held liable and responsible to protect. So you've got to fully understand not only where all of your information is flowing, but also where the specific sensitive information is located, how it's being accessed, and how it's being protected.
Let's go ahead and move on, and I hope that, Davi, if you're able to hear us, I hope that you'll dial back in and rejoin us whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'm back on.
Oh, great. Davi, so you were talking about the gravity of data, and I made my best attempt to explain what you were talking about, and Kevin did a nice job of explaining it, but I'd like to ask you to finish your thought because I think this is really relevant when it comes to protected information. If we want data to go where it needs to be, then we need to make sure that we have this balance between privacy and portability.
Yeah, the idea of gravity is that data itself becomes heavier as it becomes more important and relevant. And in the big data concept, you've got velocity, variety, and volume. So as those get more and more present, you then get heavier and heavier data. And the reason gravity works is because you have mobile, cloud, and social as emerging themes in IT. So mobile begins to circle around, social begins to circle around, right? Your most effective mobile strategy is going to have data that's very useful. Same with social. The better the data, the more people use it. So if you're talking about healthcare information, the more information in there, the more relevant that information, the sort of the heavier it is, the more likely mobile apps are going to connect to it, the more likely business associates are going to want to dig in and get access to it, do analysis of it. So it draws people to it.
It's very interesting. You mentioned mobile, social, and cloud as the sort of the three pillars of IT, and I would agree. And interesting how you tied in the fourth pillar, which is big data, and I guess big data now is the big beast that is sort of providing the umbrella for the need of all of those mobile, social, cloud, but also they're empowering even more big data. So it's a symbiotic relationship and very interesting. Let's dive into the measures that people really need to be concerned about if they're trying to ensure HIPAA compliance with their heavy data, if you will, in this case personal healthcare information. We talked about the changing IT perimeters. We talked about the on-premise of data, servers and storage, networking, and endpoints. Now let's look at cloud. And cloud is very important. If you agree, as Davi says, and I think everybody would, that cloud is one of the most important initiatives right now that is certainly shaping the IT landscape. But there are a lot of, it's everything as a service right now. But of course we have software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. And Davi, those are all important because in all cases, you're losing a little bit of control to your provider, or you're sort of delegating some control of your data, be it light or heavy, to a provider, and you may not always have the kind of visibility into the measures that they're taking to ensure that that data is secure.
That's correct. It's a relationship that relies on trust, and there's a gap that forms between what they're going to do and what you're going to do. So in the service level agreement, you can ask for a certain level of an insurance, if you will, against that gap. But ultimately, you have to figure out where your responsibilities end and where theirs begin, and who ultimately in a breach scenario, worst case scenario, would really be on the hook.
And Kevin, we talk a lot about the business associate agreements, these BAAs that are now mandated by the omnibus rule, and the idea is that this rule makes the associates of the covered entities, the hospitals, et cetera, for example, it makes them legally liable for any sort of breach, and therefore, or rather, it makes the covered entity legally liable for a breach that may happen with one of their associates. So Davi mentioned a service level agreement. Now you add a business associate agreement. We know from our discussions regarding the conduit exception that all cloud providers don't necessarily require a BAA. What can healthcare providers do to ensure that their cloud providers, beyond a service level agreement, that in fact they are just a pass-through, and that they can trust that no personal health information or protected health information is being stored on their servers or otherwise potentially accessed by people who should not be accessing it?
I think the real key to that is to ask the tough questions. I think a lot of people, a lot of businesses, the healthcare providers and business associates alike, they trust that everything is hunky-dory with a cloud because a cloud vendor has a pretty website, and maybe someone in sales that has said all the right things, and their support is good. I'm of the belief that we can have all the contracts in the world, we can have SLAs and business associate agreements, and all the legal stuff can be watertight, but it doesn't matter because a breach can still occur, and a lawsuit can still be generated, so to speak, from that subsequent breach, or you could get into trouble with HHS through some sort of HIPAA enforcement. The thing is, you've got to really step up and ask these cloud providers, what are you doing to secure this information? 99.9% of the time they'll hand over their SSAE 16 audit report and say, look, we're secure. Here's our latest audit report, and this is our data center. This is our high-level IT controls. Everything is great, but yet when you dig in and start asking more questions, and especially if you're able to perform your own assessment, your own audit, your own penetration testing of that environment, you would be surprised at the stuff that comes out, because these SSAE 16 audits are not uncovering a lot of the technical flaws. A lot of the people, the very people, the system architects, the developers at these cloud service providers, they may tell you that they're not storing sensitive information, but what's happening in situations that I've seen is that this PHI and whatever else is getting socked away in log files, server log files for the database, for the web server, and it's sitting there waiting to be exposed. I recently came across a vulnerability. I was performing an assessment for a healthcare provider in this case, and one of their servers had a bunch of PHI in log files out on an open network share. So that's one example of what can happen. There can be SQL injection. There can be really all sorts of technical vulnerabilities that are being overlooked. So my best advice is be very careful and cautious just relying on BAAs and SLAs and all that. You've got to dig in further and ask some of the tough questions and see if you can get some straight answers. And if you can't, then it may be time to find a different provider.
And isn't that sorry, go ahead, Bobby.
I would add to that, there are so many examples of flaws in environments where people say, maybe HIPAA's not working because these people had these flaws. But I think that's the incorrect view. We really shouldn't be blaming HIPAA. We should be looking at how HIPAA is bringing us closer to where we should go. That's sort of the role of regulators anyway. And enforcement's going to get tighter and tighter. So next year I expect there to be a lot more smaller actions from HHS. And I think HHS specifically was saying that you should have been compliant before now, and that goes for business associates. So the fact that business associates have to clean up their environments and get more secure isn't the weakness of the regulation. It's something that should have happened a long time ago, but the enforcement just wasn't as brutal as it's probably going to get if they don't clean it up.
And as usual,
another thing that I've seen, Josh, just real quick, Josh, another thing that I've seen, and I see this all the time, where both covered entities as well as business associates have never performed a security assessment. They have no idea where things stand, and in this particular assessment that I just mentioned, the not only was the covered entity had they not performed a security assessment, and the security rule took effect in 2005, they've never performed a security analysis. But a lot of their business associates, these EMR vendors, these health record software vendors that I know everyone would recognize the names of, they apparently have not performed their own security assessments of their own software because not due to any sort of mad skills or anything like that. I'm just using good tools and knowing where to look, but I was able to uncover some pretty serious security flaws that should have been detected years ago. And again, it's who's being held accountable here.
Well, what's really changing is those business associates are not only accountable now, but they actually have to hold their subcontractors accountable. And the covered entities aren't required to obtain that satisfactory assurance anymore. The business associate has to get the satisfactory assurance from their subcontractors.
Right.
Well, I think you guys have done a much better job of saying what I wanted to say, but I'll just recap it because I think it's very important. First of all, I want to say HHS, which Davi mentioned a moment ago, U.S. Health and Human Services, which is responsible for HIPAA and the rules that have fallen out of HIPAA. But to their point, isn't that, as you were alluding to, Kevin, isn't that the whole point of these new omnibus rules, is to ensure that healthcare providers and their associates do in fact know that, yes, we're watching you and we do think that healthcare information should be protected, and we're providing these penalties so that you know that these things that you should have been doing, now there's penalties if you don't do them.
There are consequences, absolutely, and that's back to Davi's point earlier. He said that HIPAA is sort of in place to help push us further, closer to where we need to be. And I mean these are really basic, fundamental business practices, IT and security practices that really should already be in place. But now they're just these organizations are being held accountable. But I'll still attest to the fact that just because you have it in writing, just because someone says they're doing the right things, doesn't mean that everything is secure. But at the end of the day, you can only do so much. You can only get so much of a guarantee that other people are doing or basically carrying their weight.
And we're focusing right now on SLAs and BAAs as we're talking about the changing IT perimeters. And certainly when we talk about cloud, we're focusing on that right now because it becomes very important to the conversation in just a moment. So I would like to just ask everybody to hold on to this and understand that there is a difference when you talk about software as a service and platform as a service and infrastructure as a service, because many times software as a service may in fact your vendors may be able to invoke this conduit exception because they're not actually housing any of this data, but it's terribly important, as Kevin says, to ensure that that is in fact the case, and that even if they're not hosting that data or somehow allowing any sort of unwanted access, you need to be sure that they've taken the extra steps. When Kevin talks about finding information that could be protected in log files, for example, that's a problem. So don't let their assurance be enough. Ask them for proof of that. And there are vendors now who specialize in HIPAA compliance. They use it as a marketing tool to be able to say we're HIPAA compliant, because obviously healthcare is a burgeoning field right now. But challenge them. Ensure that you're going to be covered. It by no means does everything that we're talking about only apply to cloud vendors. Of course, it also applies to these on-premises services, software, for example. There are a lot of EMR and EHR management solutions out there, and it's important for you to also know that they're protecting that data, even if you think that you have it well in hand because it's on your own servers. And as we move on,
I can give you a couple examples of questions you should ask. So, for example, when you're in the infrastructure as a service environment, you can ask if the assurances they give you are for the actual place that your data will be in. So what I found is that, I won't give names, but some very large infrastructure service providers will tell you that they're ISO certified or even HIPAA certified, and your data, once it's in their environment, especially if you're in virtual machines that can move around, will be in this secure environment. But if you look at the fine print, you may find that the one facility or data center, physical facility that they had assessed was in England, and your data is not going to be in England. It's not going to be in that facility that was assessed. So make sure that if you get an assurance from them, it is for the place that your data will be. And maybe you can get an assurance that your data will not leave that place and go somewhere else that is not compliant, or to another physical location that hasn't passed inspection or been audited to your satisfaction. In terms of software as a service, there are companies that are actively marketing that they have HIPAA and high-tech compliance, even though they have no formal certification or stamp of approval for their designations. They'll just say, we're there. And a very specific question you can ask is, if I upload a file, for example, with the name, like in terms of storage, the name of the file itself is sensitive. Can you assure me that no one can see that file name, let alone what's inside the file? So, for example, a file could be called, cancer results for patient name in the file name itself. And so those are the sorts of things you can ask, the detail of exposure you get in a software-based service environment.
That's a great point. And if I can add something, I wrote an article for a website. This was back 11 years ago, I believe, called HIPAA Compliance Doesn't Come in a Box. And a lot of these vendors, the cloud vendors, the standalone software vendors, independent software developers, they'll tell you, buy our software and we will make you HIPAA compliant. I think everyone's probably heard that, but the reality is that's not true. Their software will help you or may help you become HIPAA compliant, but HIPAA is obviously so much more. And to Davi's point, that we could spend the rest of our session today talking about what kind of questions to ask cloud providers. I actually have a list of those questions. If you want to go to my website, it's principallogic.com/resources. And I have a cloud security link, and within that link there are several articles that I've written on what kind of questions that you can ask.
Kevin, I'm actually going to force your hand on that one and say I think that we should do a presentation on that specifically. So I'm inviting you back to discuss that, because I do think it's important.
All right.
And we talk, to Davi's point, when we talk about this idea that there is no certification, the laws are clearly very confusing, but we do know that there are these conduit exceptions, and I'll just use our sponsor as a great example. We've talked about it in the past, but fax is obviously extremely important in healthcare environments. It's a, if not a primary source of communication, certainly a very important one, because doctors and pharmacies, etc., are still using fax as a secure way of conveying information. How important is it to understand exactly where information like an electronic fax is actually ending up and going to be stored, and how is it being transmitted and captured and consumed by the end user? Is that the sort of question that would fall into this area of sort of a primary need to ask as soon as possible?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because that's a big difference between someone who maintains and store information, which would be covered, versus the conduit, which is merely passing. I think the conduit exception is really designed in the way that you could be a network provider, such as a phone company, and because you don't really know anything about the data traveling, the level of scrutiny is much lower than somebody who actually has the ability to see into the data or access the data.
And to Kevin's
right,
point,
absolutely.
Go ahead, Kevin. I'll let you have the last word on this one.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, tongue-in-cheek, I'll say that knowing what we now know about the NSA, we have to figure, have they signed business associate agreements now that they can basically see everything that we're doing all the time, anywhere. But the thing is, you've got to be careful with where that data is going. That data may end up on an unencrypted laptop. It may end up on within a database on a server that is not properly patched or has a weak password that's accessible from the internet. It's not just the conduit, and it's not just, okay, now that we've sent it, everything is good. You've got to look at the whole. I guess it's really the information life cycle from the creation of it to the transmission and ultimate destruction of it. Where does it go, and where does it end up, and how is it currently at risk?
Yeah, I just dumped all the data off HHS. Anybody can do it. You can go to their public breach site now and look at the data. and I found 50% of the 27 million people affected since 2009 were affected by thefts. Only about 5% were from hacking, but the vast majority. Actually, if you add theft and loss, that's about 30 plus 50%. Loss is 30%. So you're talking 80% of 27 million people affected, according to HHS, were from data being maintained and stored improperly.
And of course, that leads us to the last point on this grid, which is the rise of mobile. Again, going back to your point earlier, Davi, cloud, mobile, social, mobile being one of the primary pillars right now for IT. And then when you start to talk about data breaches and the fact that you have lost and stolen data, and you combine that with your point of gravity of heavy data is obviously becomes more important. But a lot of that heavy data is now on end user devices as opposed to either an on-premises server or a cloud service provider, whatever the case may be. But our devices have become incredibly smart and incredibly important, and you throw on top of that the fact that a lot of those devices are owned by the employees, probably not as much in a healthcare environment in terms of patient information, but certainly emails, etc. And this really raises the need to treat devices a little more carefully because, quite frankly, if you don't have some sort of mobile device management solution in place that's providing a minimal level of security, you may in fact be in violation of the HIPAA rules, and it deserves your extra care because if you talk about lost and stolen data, what else do you lose or have stolen more often than a personal device? I don't imagine that people are stealing hard drives and servers out of hospital data centers. Is some of this happening from endpoints and mobile devices?
Yeah, you'd be surprised actually. So sometimes people buy an extra hard drive and they connect it to their laptop. So one case I know of in particular, which I think led to a $750,000 fine, was the hard drive of the laptop was encrypted, but the backup drive was not encrypted, and the user had individually connected it themselves to make sure that they didn't lose their data. The bag was stolen that had both of them inside, and then they had to report it as a breach just from like a broken car window or something. But I guess to your larger point, the thing that frustrates me is that when you get into the mobile space, you really get into a strange provider relationship. So, for example, if you have a telecom provider that provides a mobile device but refuses to update the operating system of that device, so it has known vulnerabilities on it, you're not managing that. It's a BYOD. You're not managing that device. The provider isn't updating it anymore. So how do you create that secure space on that device that user is using? You really have to get to a place where you're actually putting an application that is HIPAA aware on the device. You can't rely on people bringing devices and having them properly patched or safe. So perimeters shrink down to the very connection between you and your devices. You have to get it down to the data level, or at least the application level.
Well, and what we're seeing here, that when you look at the gist of information security, minimizing information risks, it's all about visibility and control. And with mobile, we're moving in the exact opposite direction that we need to be headed in. We're losing visibility, we're losing control, and in many cases, I would say most cases that I see, users are actually being held responsible for data backups, for encryption, for passwords, because it's their device or it's sort of out of sight and out of mind, and IT can't deal with it. And when you start letting users make decisions about security, that's when you start getting into compliance violations and increased information risks.
Now, Kevin, a moment ago before we move on, you had mentioned, and we're going to talk a lot more about these issues, so have no fear, folks. But Kevin, you had mentioned an article that you had written that was available, I think, on the Principal Logic website. Is that correct? On the steps or the questions that people should ask their vendors. Is it principallogic.com?
Principallogic.com, and I believe it's directly linkable. Yeah, if you go to principallogic.com, go to the resources page. I have a compliance link underneath the articles section, just down at the very bottom. It's one of the first articles I ever wrote. HIPAA compliance doesn't come in a box. You could actually just Google that term and pull it up, and it's amazing. I still see this. I actually see it I've seen it as a consultant, as an IT practitioner, and as an expert witness. I've worked on a legal case involving a vendor saying, hey, buy our software, we'll make you compliant, and then it ended up being that, well, no, that's not really the case, and there are lawsuits generated around this very thing. So it's an important topic. So make sure that you and all the other decision makers in your organization are on board with what's happening.
We're being bombarded for questions on that, so thank you very much. Again, go to Principle Logic, that's PRINCIPLE, Logic, LOGIC, .com. Go to the resources section, and under the compliance header, look for HIPAA compliance. Doesn't come in a box, or you can Google that term, as Kevin says. Now, Davi, before we move on to the next section, I just want to ask you, to your point about the importance of securing mobile devices now, do you find that despite the trend across all industries of BYOD, does the new, really we keep calling it HIPAA rules, I guess it would really be more part of the High-Tech Act, is BYOD a bad idea in a healthcare setting simply because of all of these concerns about where data may be accessible or how a stolen device might be used to access that data?
No, it's not always a bad idea. It can actually be an excellent idea. There's an economics argument here that if you allow BYOD, you find people basically subsidizing better devices, newer devices, so it can really help you because they're bringing in faster, better, more modern technology because they themselves are interested in that transformation. That opens up new opportunities to use newer apps, better technology, faster encryption, and so forth. But like anything, it has a double-edged sword effect to it. So while they bring in these new devices, if you're not prepared to put on an app that has the right encryption, then it may have nothing on it, and it opens you up to more risk. So it's really, you want to be a partner, a service provider essentially, in the sense that in a BYOD environment, it only really works well when the service provider can keep up with the demand and there's a relationship where people don't feel like they have to go outside to something and they don't have the skill or the expertise to evaluate it themselves. As we were saying earlier, if people go off on their own, they tend to do bad things. But if they go off with help, with somebody they trust who knows what to look for, then you get the best of both worlds. You get your own device and it's more secure.
So it really is the case of embracing it rather than having people who are misusing it and you don't have control over it. To Kevin's point, if you think of security as an issue of visibility management and control, this is a perfect case being made for MDM with BYOD in a healthcare environment because at least you have some control over that device and you know that you can even secure it after the fact if it's stolen or lost.
That's right. What you want is active participation,
Yeah.
and BYOD opens up participation quite a bit.
Yeah, and I've got a couple of points to that, Josh. Davi, you mentioned that if you let people bring in their own devices, and they're probably going to be more modern and presumably more secure, at least more up to date. It's interesting. I mean, I have a pretty up to date device myself. I've got a Samsung Galaxy Note 2, which came out a little over a year ago. But my service provider, my cell phone provider, has apparently decided that this phone is no longer worthy because the Note 3 is out, and they haven't updated the version of Android on this in quite a while, and there are quite a few updates, security updates to the operating system. And I had actually never thought of that angle to the whole BYOD thing, especially when it comes to the carrier limiting what you can do to update the device. So that's a big concern. And
you don't want to get me started on this because ultimately I think there's a failure of Google in the marketplace because Google is allowing Android to be promoted as an open platform, but they really are still keeping it as a proprietary one. So they're giving, for example, Verizon is giving you a device on Android, but Google is not forcing Verizon to update Android to the latest version, and that's a major gap in the Android ecosystem right now that's causing a lot of security risk. Google should take responsibility,
Absolutely.
I think, I'll just say it, and they should force updates to be available on those devices.
And now, Davi, I think I should commit you to another webinar. Let's move on, you guys, if you don't mind. Kevin, I'm going to turn your words, not really turn them against you, but I love this quote when we were planning this webinar, I found this. It was something you did for TechTarget a while back. It's been around for a while, but you said data in transit, especially data traversing the internet, is not the big security risk it's made out to be. I'm going to ask you to explain yourself because I think it's a really good segue to what I want to talk about as we begin to come into the home stretch.
Okay. Well, obviously things have changed since I wrote that. I believe that article is 7 or 8 years old. Knowing what we now know about who is monitoring things and who is watching us and what can be done, and knowing that the inherent vulnerabilities in the SSL protocol, there are web application vulnerabilities that can facilitate man-in-the-middle attacks. There are obviously wireless network vulnerabilities. So I still will attest to the fact that data in transit is not nearly as at risk as data at rest. There is some risk. There's so many different factors and so many different situations. So I can't possibly say yes, it's always at risk. There's a lot going on. There are a lot of moving parts to that scenario. But I will say that data at rest is many, many, many times more vulnerable than data in transit because data can be in more than one place at one time. It can be copied. Many of the controls that are needed to actually protect data and to actually monitor who's accessing it, where it goes, and all that, they're not implemented or they're under-implemented within any given organization. You go ask any healthcare provider, any business associate, do you know who has access to your data? Do you know where it's currently located? And they're probably going to tell you, no, we honestly don't know. Or if they tell you, yeah, we know where everything is, and then you start digging in further, it's going to be in server log files. It's going to be on unencrypted laptops. It's going to be on mobile devices that management say they have nothing sensitive stored on them. It's everywhere. So the risk of something happening to data at rest is greater really because of the fact that it's everywhere, but there are also a lot more vulnerabilities that are much easier to exploit to gain unauthorized access when data is at rest.
Davi, I know from our conversations that you more or less agree. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I mentioned a moment ago that we were going to talk more about the importance of cloud. And when you talk about data at rest versus data in transit, cloud is a very, very, for lack of a better term, a central theme here because we're now using the cloud, the public cloud, I should say, as opposed to private cloud, which would be your kind of a abstraction now of your on-premises resources, but this public cloud we're using for both data transmission and also data storage. So data at rest. How important is cloud when you look at data at rest and so many people going to Amazon Web Services and any of the other providers out there? Are they taking the steps that they need to take to protect your data on their servers, and is this simply a matter, as you guys both said earlier, of questioning them and challenging them and asking them exactly what measures they're taking to protect protected health information?
Well, I have to say, I think the answer is absolutely not. They're not taking the necessary measures. And I say that so strongly because their number one objective is reliability of service. They want to be up, and they will make sacrifices to confidentiality. They will give more people more access in order to keep those services running. So behind the scenes, it's sort of the dirty secret, they're focused on not applying patches because that patch might take a system down. They have to have uptime. Or they might not put a control in place because what if that control accidentally stopped someone from actually getting to data they needed? So their focus, these SaaS providers, is really access to data. It's the future of these giant lakes and giving more people more access more often. Trying to get them to put into place controls that we want after the fact is becoming expensive and difficult. And so that's why before I was saying you need to ask them specifically who can see this file name itself, not who can do a file list of all the files in a directory, because they might think that's not important, but actually you can have sensitive information in those file names. So they can do definitely a lot more, and I think we need to put more pressure on the software providers. Now, at the infrastructure layer, it's a different story. That's more a question of, are they allowing enough transparency in their audits? Are they allowing people to physically access those environments and look around and verify that the controls are in place that they say there are? And I think they could do more in terms of transparency in terms of letting people look at the controls they have in place to validate them.
Yeah, Davi, I think that's a huge problem. I think it's, and I guess I can understand where they're coming from. These cloud providers, these IT infrastructure providers, they don't want other people constantly poking and prodding and peeking into their environments. But even if they did allow it, there's still that chance, and I think it's a decent chance that these weaknesses are going to be overlooked. So, security's not perfect. You're never going to find every vulnerability when you're doing a security assessment, but you've got to keep doing it. And I see this a lot where these providers they get a one-time assessment, or these healthcare providers they assume that everything is being taken care of. But man, you've got to dig in initially, and then you've got to keep digging in, because you're going to uncover new stuff practically every time you look.
And of course, data in transit, you guys, has its own challenges. We talk a lot about the need for encryption, but to your point, Kevin, and I know you qualified it, and certainly there is a lot of news right now at the end of 2013 in terms of how data is being captured in transit and stored. This is sort of, I guess, one of the downsides of big data, is the fact that there's so much out of there. But is encryption enough? Is that the best way now to protect data in transit, or are there other steps that can be taken to protect all of this information when it's in motion?
Well, I'm certainly not smart enough to know if there's anything beyond encryption. Encryption is the best thing that I can think of. There are proven protocols, but obviously we're finding out now that they have backdoors, they have vulnerabilities that can be exploited by the bad guys, whoever. So, again, this gets back to the whole thing. How much security do you need? What extent do you go? What length do you go? And how much money do you spend actually securing this stuff? And putting on my expert witness hat, looking at it from a legal perspective, you would have to say, well, did this organization do what was reasonable? Do what was standard, do what was quote-unquote best practice, and if you are following those guidelines, I think that could be defensible if something does happen. I don't know of any other way to improve the security of data in transit.
Well, I mean, I can say that we've been doing encryption wrong for quite a while. For the past 2 years, I've been giving presentations and asking the SaaS providers why they're not doing perfect forward secrecy. In other words, in 1976, we had this model that we knew about, and in the 80s we had some implementations of it, but yet today, for the past few years, we've been doing a poor job of doing encryption properly. And so the level above encryption is really better encryption. Just like getting people to behave properly,
right.
Like manage keys properly, it gets into the human element. Encryption really is the best answer, especially if you get to homomorphic encryption. People talk about that now as though it's here, but it's really not. But when we get to the point in which we can do it, it's still going to be the human element above it that's going to make it successful.
Right.
Homomorphic just makes you sound smart, Davi, so I appreciate you bringing that in. I want to leave enough time for these questions, so I just want to make one last point before we take as many of these questions as we can. One of you guys mentioned this on one of our calls, and I liked it. I kind of refer to it now as the 5 Ps, portability with privacy, and this is by no means intended to be comprehensive or conclusive, but I just would like for everybody to remember this came from Davi and Kevin in some previous conversations, and they talked about the need for a pervasive approach to HIPAA compliance. And because we have so many single logons now, passwords are essential. That goes without saying, but there are certainly good passwords and good and bad passwords. That speaks to the third P on this. If portability and privacy are the first 2 Ps, then passwords, passcodes, and policies are the 3 that follow. Passwords would be determined by strong policies. Passcodes, of course, different than passwords, at least colloquially, in terms of there's a difference between somebody entering information, humans interfacing with machines to log on, and machines speaking to one another, if you will. And guys, I don't mean to misrepresent that, but this is the issue of encryption. And unless I'm oversimplifying way too much, but the idea is that information can only be encoded and decoded by machines that are certified and allowed to do that encoding and encryption and decryption. Is there anything beyond these 3 Ps, passwords, passcodes, and policies when it comes to portability and privacy, guys?
I would wrap it up into identity. I think identity and access management is another way of looking at it. So it doesn't fit the P's, but the problem with passwords is they're a secret that are easily shared and they're often written poorly. So there are many examples of weak passwords, and we need to get away from passwords and move towards behavior. So when you think about how you identify somebody as friend or foe, family, friend, or a stranger, you're looking at thousands of data points, like how they walk, what they're wearing, their smell. We have so many sensors firing all at the same time to tell us trusted versus untrusted. But when we get on the computer, we have one secret that somebody could have easily stolen and given to us or figured out because it's so weak. So I think the future, especially environments like healthcare where we have so much data available to us, really rich, heavy data source, we can ask people for quite a bit more information before we give them our trust.
And I
like that approach, Dobby. Yeah, I was going to say, when you look at this, you look at all the data breach studies, the security reports that come out every year. There's one in particular that stands out to me that I always enjoy reading. It's the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. Every year, they come out and basically uncover what the greatest problems are, the greatest risks, how these breaches are occurring, and it's almost always the same stuff. You can really apply the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule to this. 80% of the security flaws come from, or 80% of the security risk comes from 20% of the vulnerabilities that are exploited. And if you focus on that 20%, the policies, the passwords, the patching, your ongoing security testing that's often overlooked, you're going to be able to fix most of your security problems. Once you get all that stuff straightened out, standardized, you have a good flow going month after month and year after year, then I tell people, then you can focus on some of the more advanced issues, implement some of the more advanced technologies, but unless and until you fix these basics, this low-hanging fruit that keeps getting exploited, you're going to continue facing these challenges.
Yeah, I can tell you an even better statistic that 2.4% of the high-risk vulnerabilities are actually attacked. So if you look at the recent paper by Dan Geer and Michael Reutman, it could completely change your perspective on how to prioritize what you should be patching based on, patch the stuff that's actively being attacked in the wild. And if you look at the attack tools, of course, it tells you these are the things that we're actively attacking. Whereas if you just look at the scores, it's sort of a guess of what's most vulnerable or what would be most likely to be attacked.
Okay, guys, I'm going to move on to the Q&A now because we have a lot of them, as you can imagine. I'm sure you guys find this wherever you go. First of all, a couple of quick notes. Alan, thank you. Alan says, implement two-factor authentication wherever possible. I think you're absolutely right, particularly when outsiders are accessing any sort of company resources, be they on-premises or cloud. And first question of the day, you guys. And one other thing. Yes, these slides will be made available. You can download them. You'll receive a link for the on-demand webinar, and then you'll have the opportunity to download the slides from that on-demand link, and we hope that you'll do so. We also hope that you'll share that link with whomever you feel appropriate so that they can take advantage of the information that Davi Ottenheimer and Kevin Beaver have shared today. Okay, first question, you guys, and I like this one a lot, comes from Delbert. Delbert says, what advice on HIPAA compliance do you have for app developers? So Delbert's going to use patient information to disseminate through an app that he's developing. What are the resources? Kevin, certainly he probably can go and look at your HIPAA compliance does not come in a box article and reverse engineer that, but do either of you have any additional information for Delbert that he might be able to use?
I would say I wrote a guest blog post called "What Can Developers Do to Better Protect PII?" I wrote that a little over a year ago, and it's all about the facilitating the basic security controls within the application. It's providing users the option, or maybe even enforcing users the option to set strong passwords. The vendors that I told you about earlier, the EMR vendors, they weren't even requiring strong passwords. You can't enforce the strong password policy if it's not even an option. So you can go in and put ABC123 as the password, or 5 ones or whatever, and it's that simple, and it's that vulnerable. You can disable auto completion and form logins. Of course, enforce SSL across the board. Disable test accounts, make sure your session management is under control. There's so many things that you can do. Look at the article or the blog post that I wrote called "What Can Developers Do to Better Protect PII?" and that will give you a little more guidance.
That all sounds exactly right. I would also add that just assume component failure and assume change. So don't hard code anything. One of the flaws I see most often that's tragic is, for example, hard coding an account or password into an application, or hard coding the level of encryption when it has to change. Everything changes in security. We're constantly upgrading and improving. So assume failure and assume change.
So the next question comes from Dana, and this is a question that's asked quite a bit, actually. How do we lock down ubiquitous access in printing? Any references for help on this? Davi, maybe I'll start with you on this one. The idea that you don't always have control of what's happening to the data when it arrives at its destination. Any advice, any resources that you can recommend for Dana?
Well, locking down ubiquitous access is it's the question of gravity. It's as data becomes more and more heavy, as it basically expands because more and more people are connecting to it and using it for things. How do you control access? And that's identity and access management. You really need a proper strategy to manage identities and manage classification of that information so that you can say this person has access to that data. Without an IAM strategy, identity access management, that's like nearly impossible. And without a content classification strategy saying that this is sensitive versus this is just random text, nobody cares if it's public information, you won't have a very good chance of taking ubiquitous access away. Printing is, that's a whole topic in itself, but some of the things I've run into that are, I guess, worth noting are we locked down access to the point where some people ended up printing everything out. So they were literally taking screenshots and printing it. So we monitored printers for jobs, excessive amounts of paper being printed, for example, or faster toner use than usual. And that actually unbelievably revealed people were printing out every screen that they were working on that day and putting it into a filing cabinet, which then became extremely sensitive.
Oh, no.
And they were doing it in their mind, they did it for business reasons because they had a workflow before that they had a way of keeping track of everything they had done for months. And since we took all that access away, they decided they would create their own new workflow. Once we figured out the workflow, we could fix it. But we also had to get rid of that. And we figured it out by looking at the printer. We had to get rid of that workflow they'd created for themselves.
And I guess that speaks volumes about that third P on that privacy and portability, which is policies that explain to people not to do that sort of thing, which is very interesting. Kevin, the next question I think is a great one for you. Bob wants to know, are there any specific security requirements in place regarding protecting PHI from the IT support employees who support the data center? Now, this is really interesting. You mentioned the fact that you found a bunch of PHI and some logs. I guess that would be covered under HIPAA in general. You're liable because as a covered entity, for example, it's assumed that there will be employees on a need-to basis. They have reason to need to access that data. Am I oversimplifying?
Well, you definitely have to watch the watchers, so to speak. You can't lock down all data all the time from all people except for that one doctor, the one researcher, office manager, whoever that needs access to it. Someone is going to have access, but this goes back to the fact of you cannot secure what you don't acknowledge. A lot of people don't know who has access to what. They don't know where it is. They don't know how it's currently at risk. And if you do know that information, you can tighten things down to a point. But even then, there are going to be ways for IT folks to to go in and reset a password or somehow view network traffic. It's possible. It's always possible. If you have admin access to a network, then you're always going to have that capability in all but the most stringent of networks, which is really, unless you're in the federal government and military grade type applications, it's going to be really impractical to lock the network down to that level. But if you have the proper monitoring, you might have some technologies like DLP, data leakage prevention, data loss prevention, some other endpoint type controls. You can actually see what's happening, who's accessing what on the servers, on the workstations, and then really have that good insight that you need. But unless and until you figure out who has access, who needs access, how it's at risk, and putting those the proper controls into place, that you're going to continue to struggle. So you've got to start at the very beginning.
Kevin Beaver, Davi Ottenheimer, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Before we go again, I want to remind everyone that the information provided in this presentation does not constitute and is no substitute for legal or other professional advice. We strongly encourage you to consult your own legal or other professional advisors for individualized guidance regarding the application of the law to your particular situations and in connection with any compliance-related concerns. I'm Josh Kingold, and this has been a special presentation of Ziff Davis, How the Conduit Exception Affects the HIPAA Liability of Cloud Service Providers, brought to you by eFax Corporate, the world's #1 online fax brand. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day.